They say you can chart a life by the moments that tilt it, quietly at first, until everything you thought was certain sits at a new angle. Mine began on a rainy Thursday, when the kitchen clock stuttered past 7 and my son stepped in, damp at the edges, carrying a truth that wouldn't wait for a sunnier day. I didn't know it then, but the look in his eyes would redraw the house I thought I knew, and the woman I thought I was. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. The storm had started in the late afternoon, thin needles at first, then a steady curtain that made the streetlights look shy. I was at the kitchen sink rinsing cups that never seemed to stay dry, listening to the kettle breathe on the stove. The window had fogged at the corners, and my reflection, 52, and still startled by the silver sneaking into my hair, looked back at me like an old friend who'd finally learned to keep good company. When I heard the front door, I didn't turn right away. My son Daniel usually texted first. He was considerate like that, the sort who'd stand in the rain rather than track footprints onto a clean floor. The latch clicked, the hinges sighed, and he called, "Mom?" in that careful way he uses when he's not sure how much space a word will take up. "In here," I said, drying my hands on the towel with the faded strawberries. He came into view, all broad shoulders and rain-dark hair, shaking drops from his jacket. He'd always looked like his father from a distance, same walk, same set of jaw. But as he grew older, he carried himself with a gentler ease, as if he had learned that strength isn't noise. He set his keys on the counter, and for a second, he didn't speak. He just looked at me. It was a steady, level look, not a challenge, not a plea, something else. Something like a bridge being lowered between two forts that had learned to defend themselves too well. "You hungry?" I asked, buying myself a moment, reaching for the extra bowl I keep for him out of habit. I lifted the lid from a pot of chicken soup, the good kind with parsley and lemon that can rescue even a tired day. Steam rose, carrying the clean scent of comfort, and I ladled some into his bowl, waiting for him to sit. He didn't. He stayed standing, one hand on the back of the dining chair, like he needed the wood to steady a decision. "Mom," he said, and it was the way he said it that made me sober up behind the eyes. Not impatient, not afraid. A man about to choose his words because he knows they will move furniture in someone else's heart. "Can we talk?" I nodded, and we sat, me at the corner of the table where I like the lamp's warm cone of light, him across where he could see the front door and I could see the kitchen window. The rain made soft footprints against the glass. He wrapped his hands around the bowl the way he did as a boy after soccer practice, seeking warmth not so much for the fingers as for the courage that travels in the blood. "I got an offer," he began. "It's not what we expected." I felt my back straighten. For a year, he'd been with a firm downtown. Solid work, good people, the kind that give you benefit forms thick enough to stop a door. His father had been proud, even near the end, when voices were soft and time was measured in pill bottles. We had quietly laid our hopes like folded shirts into that career, smoothing the corners, pretending we didn't see the tag that said, "Do not tumble dry. Dreams may shrink." "What kind of offer?" I asked. He drew a breath that traveled the length of him. "There's a community center across the river. You know the one. Underfunded, drafty gym, after-school program that barely keeps the lights on. They want me to run a mentorship program, full-time. Build it from the ground up." His eyes flicked up, and in them I saw not the boy who needed permission, but the man who wanted partnership. "It's less money, a lot less, and it's different. But when I'm there, Mom, something makes sense. It feels like I'm useful in a way I can't shake when I'm behind a desk. The kettle clicked itself off with a small, declarative sound. Outside, a car hissed past like a whisper that knew better than to linger. I had 100 responses ready, practical ones, motherly ones, the kind that tally rent and insurance and future plans on an invisible ledger, but none of them lined up with the look in his eyes. That look said he'd already wrestled with the numbers and come here to wrestle with something else. With me, or rather, with the version of me that still needed him to be a certain kind of successful to know she had done her job. I placed my hands flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread as if I could feel the grain of the wood steady me. When did you start thinking about this? I managed. His mouth turned in a small, apologetic half-smile. Maybe the day you found me cleaning out Dad's old toolbox, he said. I was looking for more than a wrench. We both laughed softly at the memory of him on the garage floor with dust on his knees and that baffled tenderness that comes when you hold an object that knew your father's hands better than you did. The laugh lifted something between us, like a window unlatched. This isn't about running away, I asked. From expectations? From me? He shook his head. It's about running toward who I am when I'm with those kids. They listen, Mom. Not always, not perfectly. But they look at me like I can point to a light switch they didn't know was there. I looked at my son, really looked, the way you study a familiar street after a new rain has washed the dust off the signposts. Once I taught him to tie his shoes by looping the laces into rabbit ears and whispering, "Don't pull too hard. Let the knot learn you." Now here he was teaching me a gentler knot, how to hold my dreams for him without strangling his own. I worry, I admitted, and the word felt like a coat I had worn too long. About bills. About the long winters. About you waking up in 5 years and feeling like you stepped off a train that would have taken you somewhere safer. I know, he said. I worried too. But I also worry about not trying. About staying just because it's comfortable. About growing a life that looks good in a frame but feels empty in the room. The clock above the pantry coughed its way to 7:30. The soup cooled. The rain softened. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked at nothing and was answered by the kind of silence that knows when it's being tested. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. His fingers were warm, firm, the same as when he clutched mine before crossing the street, and yet entirely new, as if the years had carved a steadier current through them. When you looked at me just now, I said, I felt something change. Not you asking permission, not me giving it. Something. Equal. Like we're standing on the same side of the question. He nodded, eyes bright but steady. That's exactly how it feels. I could have said no. I could have asked for more time, more details, more proof, chiefly to buy my heart a few extra days before it had to learn a new rhythm. But motherhood, I am learning, is the art of loosening without letting go. I thought of your father, I wanted to say to him, and how the last gift he gave us wasn't advice but attention. He listened so hard at the end that even the smallest truth felt brave in his presence. Okay, I said, the word simple as a door opening. Let's talk about how to make it work, not whether you're allowed to want it. The relief that moved through his shoulders was almost visible. He sat back, then forward again, the way a man does when the map finally matches the road. We discussed numbers, rent, groceries, the old car that coughed in the mornings and would need a kinder mechanic. We made lists. Who to call, what to cancel, where to find cheaper coffee without sacrificing the small pleasure of it. He told me about a boy named Marcus who could dribble a ball like a song and a girl named Janelle who wrote poems about the ocean though she'd never stood at its edge. He spoke their names with respect. Not pity, not savior talk. Respect, as if every person carried a room inside them, and he'd been invited to knock. At some point, I poured us tea. The steam braided up between us like a soft flag signaling a truce we didn't know we needed. The house, usually an expert at holding its breath during important conversations, seemed to exhale. The lamp hummed. The refrigerator, that old metronome of domesticity, kept time. And me, I realized I had been bracing for years, long after I needed to. Bracing for the next crisis, for the next goodbye, for the next proof that love is something you must guard like a fragile heirloom. But love in that moment felt more like a well, deep, quiet, fed by sources you can't always trace. We didn't solve everything. How could we? A life doesn't pivot in one conversation and call it settled. But when he stood to leave, pulling on his jacket and tucking the keys into his pocket, he paused at the doorway and met my eyes again. There it was, the look. Not of a boy asking, not of a mother weighing, but of two grown people recognizing the same horizon. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," I answered, and meant it. After he left, I stood at the window and watched the rain lift, the street shining clean, as if the day had been rinsed and set out to dry. In the glass, my reflection seemed softer, less stubborn at the edges. I pressed my palm to the cool pane and realized that the change I felt wasn't loss. It was room, space where fear had sat too loudly, making it hard to hear anything else. I turned off the lamp, rinsed the bowls, and folded the strawberry towel over the oven handle. When I went to bed, the house didn't feel emptier. It felt honest, like a story that had finally found the right first line. And though I didn't know the chapters ahead, I knew this much. When my son looked into my eyes that night, everything didn't break. It aligned. The morning after that conversation, I woke up with the sound of rain still clinging faintly to the gutters, though the sky outside had already begun to open into a pale blue. My first thought was of Daniel, not as a boy this time, but as the man who had sat across from me last night, steadying his courage against the wooden back of a chair. Sleep had softened the edges of what we'd said, but not the weight of it. If anything, the quiet hours had given his words more depth, like ink settling into paper overnight. I moved slowly through my morning ritual, boiling water for coffee, cracking open the kitchen window for a little air, letting the coolness kiss my skin as I breathed in the scent of damp earth. It was comforting, familiar, and yet my chest felt oddly light, like something that had been pressing down for years had quietly lifted. Still, I knew that one conversation was not enough. This change, his decision, my acceptance, was not a door closed but one just opening, and I wasn't sure yet what waited on the other side. By the time Daniel came back later that day, I had already straightened the living room twice, fussed with the cushions, and set out a plate of crackers and cheese as if he were a guest instead of my son. It's a habit I've never broken, the need to prepare a space, to show love in small practical gestures. He noticed, of course. He always does. "Mom," he said with a smile, shaking his head gently, "you don't have to lay out snacks every time we talk." "I know," I answered, waving him toward the couch. "But it makes me feel better." He dropped his bag near the door and sat, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. That same look from last night was still in his eyes, steady, grounded, but edged with a vulnerability that reminded me he wasn't as sure of himself as he wanted me to believe. "I spoke with the director today," he began, "about the program. They want me to start shadowing next week, just to get a feel for the place. Nothing official yet, but—" He hesitated, then looked at me, his gaze asking more than his words. "I wanted you to know before I commit." The sun slipped through the window blinds in golden slats, falling across his shoulders, and I found myself studying the way his hands rested together, fingers interlocked, thumb tapping lightly. I remembered those same hands clutching a pencil too tightly in 3rd grade, shaking as he tried to get his cursive letters just right. I remembered them bruised and muddy from climbing the oak tree in the yard, and scared a little later when he learned to ride his bike. Now those hands were asking me silently if I would steady him again, not by holding tighter, but by letting go with trust. "What's holding you back?" I asked softly. He shrugged. "Fear, I guess. Fear of letting you down, of failing, of making life harder for us both." His honesty cracked something in me, not because it hurt, but because it was the kind of truth children usually keep hidden from their parents. And here he was, offering it freely. I leaned closer, placing my hand over his. "Daniel, you could never let me down by choosing a life that feels true to you. Failing isn't trying and stumbling. Failing is silencing that pull inside you and calling it practical. I did that once, and I don't want you to repeat it." He looked at me curiously. "What do you mean?" I drew in a breath. It wasn't a story I told often, but maybe it was time. When I was younger, before you were born, I wanted to work in publishing. I loved words, reading them, shaping them, giving them to others. But then your father's job moved us, and money was tight, and I took a safer position at the bank. It wasn't bad work. It paid the bills. But every time I walked past the bookstore downtown, I felt a little ache in my chest, like a room inside me had gone dark. I don't regret my life, Daniel, not at all. But I regret silencing that voice. He squeezed my hand, his face softer now, almost boyish in its openness. "I never knew that." "You weren't meant to," I said. "You were meant to feel safe. But now you're grown, and you deserve to know that safety isn't always the same as happiness." The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was alive, like soil after rain, waiting for something to grow. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then maybe it's time I stopped choosing safety. Maybe it's time I trust that voice." My heart swelled with both pride and fear, 2 companions I was learning to carry side by side. I nodded. "And maybe it's time I learned to let you." We sat together for a long while after that, the crackers untouched, the light shifting slowly across the room. I realized then that this was no longer just about his decision. It was about ours. A mother and son stepping into a new chapter, side by side, no longer defined only by the roles we once played, but by the respect we now offered one another. And though uncertainty loomed ahead, I felt something steadier beneath. That night I didn't sleep easily. I lay in bed listening to the creaks of the house, the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car hissing past on wet pavement. My thoughts turned in circles, weaving between pride for Daniel and the old reflexes of worry that seemed stitched into me. Mothers are rarely taught how to stop worrying, even when their children stand taller than them and pay their own bills. It's a habit as natural as breathing, but heavier to carry. Still, when I closed my eyes, I kept seeing his face, lit with the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't shout but waits to be heard. By morning, the air was crisp, cool enough that I had to wrap a shawl around my shoulders when I went out to fetch the paper. The neighborhood smelled of wet leaves and chimney smoke, and I let myself linger on the porch, watching the world wake up. Across the street, Mrs. Kent was clipping her roses even though they were nearly done for the season. A young couple jogged past with a dog tugging at its leash. Life, in its small routines, kept going, but I knew something inside mine had shifted. Daniel arrived around noon, carrying a folder tucked under his arm. His hair was still damp from the shower, and he wore the look of a man preparing for a conversation that mattered. I had made sandwiches, turkey on rye, his favorite, and poured us both glasses of iced tea. He set the folder down on the table almost ceremonially and looked at me. "I want you to see this," he said. Inside were outlines, notes, even sketches. Pages filled with ideas for how he could build the mentorship program. Workshops, sports activities, tutoring sessions, community events. Each page was neat, structured, but alive with energy. His handwriting, once sloppy with the impatience of youth, had matured into something steady and deliberate. "You've been working on this for a while," I said, running my hand over the papers as if I could feel the pulse in them. He nodded. "Since last year, actually. I didn't tell anyone. I guess I was scared that if I said it out loud, it would dissolve. But now I need someone to know. I need you to know." The weight of his words pressed against me, but not uncomfortably. It was the kind of weight that reminded me I was still needed, not to guide every step, but to witness them. "It's good work," I said softly. "It's meaningful." He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "But it's risky. And I don't want to drag you into the fallout if it fails. We've already had enough hard years." That's when I reached across and touched the folder. "Daniel, do you remember when you were 12 and you built that rickety birdhouse in the backyard?" He laughed suddenly, his eyes warming. "The one that leaned so much the birds refused to use it." "Yes," I said, smiling at the memory. "You cried when it fell apart in the rain. But the next week, you built another one, and that one held. Do you know why?" He tilted his head, curious. "Because I used stronger wood." "Because you learned from the first one," I replied. "Failure isn't the end of a thing. It's the teacher that walks alongside it. You've been learning your whole life. This is no different." His face softened, and in that moment I saw both the boy he had been and the man he was becoming. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. We ate our sandwiches in companionable silence after that, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Outside, the sky had cleared completely, and sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, turning the dust motes into little sparks of gold. I found myself watching Daniel, the way his jaw tightened when he thought, the way his eyes darted when his mind was alive with ideas. He wasn't a boy anymore, but he was still mine. Not mine to keep, but mine to know, mine to love. Later, he gathered the papers back into his folder and stood. "I think I'm ready," he said quietly. "Ready to take the step. Even if it's messy. Even if it scares me." I rose too, walking him to the door. My hand brushed his arm, just for a second. "You don't have to do it alone," I said. "I'm here, even if all I can do is listen. That's enough sometimes." He looked down at me with a gaze that was steady, unflinching. And there it was again, that same shift I'd felt the first night, the moment when his eyes held mine, and I knew everything had changed. Only this time, it wasn't just a flicker. It was a flame, steady and real, casting light on the road ahead. When he left, the house felt both quieter and fuller at once. Quieter without his presence, fuller with the weight of what had just been shared. I stood by the window for a long time, watching him walk down the street, tall and certain, the folder tucked under his arm like a promise he intended to keep. And in my heart, I knew this. Love doesn't stop at protecting. It expands into letting go, into trusting, into believing. Watching him disappear around the corner, I felt not the ache of loss, but the rare peace of a mother witnessing her son stepping into his own truth. The week that followed unfolded like a slow turning of seasons. Each day carried with it a quiet rhythm of change, subtle yet unmistakable. I noticed it in myself most of all, in the way my shoulders no longer carried the same tension when I thought of Daniel's future, in the way my voice softened when I spoke of his choices to friends, not as if I had to defend them, but as if I was quietly proud. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room, the lamp casting a warm glow across the shelves lined with books I had collected but never finished. I pulled one down, an old poetry collection, and let the words fall into me. They spoke of journeys, of courage, of the inevitability of change. And as I read, I realized that the story I was living was less about motherhood ending and more about it transforming. Daniel came by the next day, his face flushed with a kind of tired joy. "You should have seen them, Mom," he said as soon as he stepped inside, without even taking off his jacket. Marcus finally nailed that essay he's been working on, and Janelle read her poem out loud for the first time. The room went quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. His voice carried excitement, reverence almost, and as he spoke, his hands moved with energy, sketching the air with every story. I listened, leaning forward, caught up in his enthusiasm. I could see the spark in his eyes, the same spark I had once seen when he was a child showing me a crayon drawing as if it were a masterpiece. But this was different. This spark came from a place deeper, rooted in purpose. When he finally paused, I said, "You've found your place, haven't you?" He nodded, almost shyly. "I think I have. For the first time in a long time, I go to bed at night and feel like I'm doing what I'm meant to do." I swallowed back the lump in my throat. It was a strange mix: pride, relief, and the faint ache of knowing that my son had crossed into a space I could no longer fully guide. He wasn't looking to me for direction anymore. He was looking at me as a companion, someone who walked alongside, but not ahead. Later that night, after he had gone, I sat with a cup of tea, staring out at the darkened street. The quiet of the house felt different now. Not empty, but steady, like the pause after a deep breath. The rain had begun again, a light patter against the windows, and in it I heard echoes of our first conversation at the kitchen table. That moment when his eyes met mine and something shifted between us. It struck me then that change doesn't arrive all at once. It sneaks in through small doors, through a look, a word, a silence held without fear. When my son looked into my eyes that first night, everything I thought I knew about being his mother was rearranged. He didn't need me to shield him anymore. He needed me to see him, to trust him, to honor the man he was becoming. And I realized that my role had not ended, only evolved. I was no longer the hand pulling him across busy streets, but the presence he could turn to when he needed grounding. I was no longer the voice telling him which path to take, but the ear that listened when he spoke of the one he chose. As I finished my tea, I let the truth settle in me like a warm ember. Motherhood is not about holding on, but about holding space. And when I think back to that night, the night my son looked into my eyes and everything changed, I no longer see it as the closing of a chapter. It was the beginning of another. A story not about loss, but about love that grows larger, braver, and more enduring with every step. And so I carry that moment with me, not as an ending, but as a promise that no matter how many times the seasons turn, love will always find a way to adapt, to renew, and to remind us that the bonds we share are not bound by time, but strengthened by change.